Alright, so I'm presenting on the reading Grave Goods in Early Medieval Burial by Heinrich Hark. So grave goods basically means anything found in a grave accompanying human remains. It could refer to anything from clothing to sacrificial offerings. So, in the late 19th century, archaeologists started using grave goods to establish chronologies. Um, then they started to be used for ethnic and social inferences. The difference between those are basically that ethnic inferences mean they're like using them to identify a tribe based on the common grave objects that were used, and they use those to assume national prehistories. Social inferences are when they use grave objects to assume social status of the person buried, taking into consideration things like the amount of wealth buried with a person. Ethnic inferences have been kind of believed to be controversial today, but archaeologists still rely heavily on social inferences. The existence of grave objects heavily implies a pagan concept of an afterlife, since burying someone with an object kind of implies that um, they believe the spirit will need that object in its afterlife, and that they have an afterlife where things like material objects would even matter. And there has been a shift in Western archaeology from reconstructing past life to understanding behaviors and attitudes around death. This brings in concepts of anthropology like emotion, memory, and post mortem identities. Much of these inferences come from the grave goods that they find. From the 5th to 8th centuries, grave goods were common all across Europe, with a couple of exceptions. After that, as Christianity rose, they slowly faded out of common practice. These objects were often gender based. Hark refers to typical kits for adults. So, for adult women, that would include dress items like jewelry. Um, and then for adult men, it would usually include weapons and other separately deposited things like household items. Though rare, there were instances in Scandinavia of destroying objects as sacrifice during burial. Um, Human and animal sacrifices are also considered grave goods, and they were documented in Europe during the Viking period. So in the pictures I have on here, on the left would be like the adult woman's like kit, and on the right would be the adult man's. Grave goods are also found in cremation ceremonies, being either primary, where they are cremated with the body, or secondary, where they are placed with the ashes after cremation. It's also worth noting that decomposition plays a role in the grave goods we find today. For instance, things like cloth and woodwork would be decomposed by now. Um, it's also worth noting that things like food offerings obviously wouldn't have lasted like hundreds of years, as well as things that are made out of metal. Um, but despite this, from the 5th to 7th century, half of all men's graves contain grave objects, and 70% of all women's graves do. So then Hart goes into the different interpretations of grave goods in chronological order. The oldest interpretation is that objects were included in burials because people thought the dead would need them in the afterlife. This is true for grave goods in China up to the modern day. The European practice of this is supported through writing, like the epic poem of Beowulf. This is a distinct non Christian practice and would explain why the commonness of grave goods declined with the rise of Christianity. However, this idea is contradicted by the fact that not all grave goods would be buried with the bodies. Sometimes they would simply be present at the funeral. In the 1920s, German archaeologist Reinecke, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, thought that grave goods were a consequence of property rights. These objects were inalienable property to the deceased. And this idea kind of comes from a German law that was passed in the 10th century that kind of like split all property into two categories. Um, Basically, property that was like inalienable, that couldn't be inherited, and everything else. And burial was thought of as the only way to dispose of property that couldn't be passed down. However, being that this was a 10th century idea, it's not really relevant for the Middle Ages. This is another one I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing right. I'm gonna say potlatch. Potlatch is a concept that explains how destroying or disposing of perfectly functional and expensive objects in a way was seen as a display of wealth and status. To be able to say that I have a lot of money and can afford to bury my wife with expensive jewels tells the society around you that you cared a lot about your wife and that you deserve more respect than the poor people who can't practice those kind of burial rituals. I thought this was interesting because it reminded me of like today's funeral industry where things like caskets can cost like thousands of dollars and a lot of families feel pressured into spending that money to show that they like really cared about their deceased loved one. Another idea that objects are indicators of rank, status, and identity. Hark uses the modern example of military battles where cavalry officers are buried with the boots and stirrups that they used in battle. Um, Medieval grave goods also include signifiers of marriage, royalty, and socioeconomic status. And they also indicate religious status as well. A modern theory that these objects act as a metaphor. These goods are meant to represent the deceased's achievements or landmarks in life. For example, some graves were seen to contain objects from faraway places, possibly meant to show where that person was from. These kind of metaphors may help the grievers come to terms with the fact that this person was once alive and doing things, and now they're dead and can't do things anymore. Incorporating these objects into a funeral allows the griever to come to terms with that transformation. The metaphor is also connected to the idea of the artifact biographies. These objects, combined with textual evidence, can create a narrative of the life of the deceased. These objects may have also been gifts to the deceased. There are descriptions of Roman funerals where mourners would deposit gifts in the pyre or grave. This is similar to the potlatch, but rather than relating to the status of the living person conducting the burial, it's more related to the status of the deceased person. They may also be gifts to deities. Uh, this is seen in the practice of leaving an obulus to pay the ferryman to cross the river Styx in Egyptian mythology. A lot of these practices have to do with monetary sacrifices to supernatural beings. Some grave goods are remains of a funeral feast, such as cooking pots or food offerings themselves. The food acts as an offering, and the feast itself is an opportunity to once again establish that social class hierarchy. But it also acts as a way to solidify relationships that would otherwise be strained by the grieving process. Disposal of polluted items. This comes from the cultural belief that the dead pollutes all the people and the objects they come in contact with. Burial was seen as the best way to dispose of these items, especially if they were seen to be part of witchcraft. This is seen in East African practices as well as European and Jewish practices. Protection of the living and the dead. Superstitions about things like vampires and zombies raising from the dead caused practices like burying people with nets in scripture to keep them in their graves. And although these objects can be hard to identify because they may be broken or simply seem out of place. And then I found this image of like a metal bar, like literally wrapped around a deceased person's neck. I thought that was pretty interesting. Another explanation for these objects is the need to forget. Hark uses the example that some native tribes in North America have practiced the burning of the deceased's home, as well as the banning of mentioning of the deceased name. This explanation is used in medieval graves to account for objects that might seem like outliers. So basically, like they would just like throw in any items that reminded them too much of the person who is deceased. In conclusion, many of these categories overlap and are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Uh, a lot of these practices still exist today, and the way we think about our actions now can provide insight into how we developed these theories. And you also have to consider the historical and geographical context of these objects. Really, there are a wide range of possibilities and more questions than hard answers. Like, I feel like the same can be said about most of the things we talk about in this class. Yeah, and that is my presentation.